Donald Trump lashing out. I'm Jay O'Brien in Washington, and today's big story, Vice President Kamala Harris comes off a battleground state blitz as Donald Trump is trying to counter her momentum and her rising poll numbers. And the Republicans pleading with him to stick to policies, not personal attacks. I'll speak with Texas Republican Congressman Pete Sessions about that. And in our spotlight, Israel on high alert. Warnings a retaliatory attack by Iran and its proxies could be imminent. The U.S. moving warships into that region. Our panel weighs in on what to expect. But we do begin with the eyes of the political world on their phones tonight, even more so than they usually are, following along to former President Donald Trump's highly anticipated live interview on X with the platform's owner, Elon Musk. Trump has also started posting again from his real Donald Trump account on that platform, what was formerly Twitter. The last time he posted was a photo of his mugshot from 2023. Before that, the last time he had posted was days after January 6th, and that platform, under different ownership at the time, banned him. Trump's challenger, Vice President Kamala Harris, is fresh off a battleground state blitz, introducing her new running mate Tim Walz to the nation in rally after rally. She's also been rising in the polls, including one from the New York Times and Siena College out this weekend, showing her ahead in 3 key swing states. Her lead is within the margin of error, a sign of how close this race still is. As Harris's poll numbers have climbed and she's spoken to packed rallies, Trump has lashed out. He's even spread that false claim that her campaign used AI to increase the crowd size of a photo from a Detroit event. ABC News has examined that photo, and the crowd size was not changed. All as Trump's fellow Republicans have argued to him that that he has a winning message on several key issues, and they've pushed him to talk about policies and not use personal attacks. To unpack all of that, I want to bring in Texas Republican Congressman Pete Sessions of the great state of Texas. Congressman Sessions, thank you for joining us. I want to start with these new poll numbers out of the New York Times and Siena College poll. Battleground state polls showing Harris beating Trump within the margin of error. National polls out recently, too, showing Harris beating Trump. Is Donald Trump losing this race right now?
Jay, I think it's important for us to note that this was a complete change of plans. It was one that evidently the campaign had not preemptively prescripted about what their viewpoint would be. I think that Donald Trump will find his own footing. I think Kamala Harris will find her footing. What's unknown is what will her footing be? Will it be not to let people know where she is on the issues or to decide that? And I think that these are great questions that the American people want to know. And then that's when the real polling or data will be available once that's known. So the question would be, was Joe Biden simply unpopular because of his age? Was it his policies that he was espousing and the results that he got? And I think that is where Donald Trump still has a strategic advantage, that Kamala Harris is going to have to distance herself from the policy and distance herself from the results, or Donald Trump will score that.
So what is Trump talking about with this flat out lie about the Harris campaign using an AI altered image? He claims it is again a lie, saying that her campaign changed the crowd size at a Detroit event. Why is he doing that, in your view? Even former Speaker Kevin McCarthy has told him, as recently as this morning in an interview he gave to Fox, to stick to the policies and not talk about crowd size and not talk about personal attacks.
Well, I think common sense would tell you that it's far too early to engage in things that would be personal attacks or things that would not be truthful. The things that are not truthful or the things that are personal attacks come after someone has actually said something or been on stage and made a mistake. And it may not represent exactly where a person is, but would represent the truth about what was said. I think that this is one of the struggles that the president, meaning Donald Trump, is going to have to come to grips with. This is a new race. This is new, perhaps, facts and factors. But I think that he still has a huge advantage because Kamala Harris is going to have to decide, was she the border czar or not? What was her role and what was the success or not that came from that? And where does she agree or disagree with the policies? And that's what Donald Trump has got to get to. He's got to get to where Kamala Harris actually decides where she is and which side she's going to be on. And Donald Trump, I think, is frustrated getting there.
I want to get back to the border in a second. First off, she wasn't the border czar, right? She was in charge of migration from Central American countries, and people had labeled her the border czar. That was never a title she was given. That was never a title the administration gave her. But I want to go back to this idea of personal attacks, because Trump did the same thing when he said that she, quote unquote, turned black, which is, again, obviously false. Would you say to Trump that he's hurting his campaign by engaging in this kind of attack?
Well, I think anyone who would bring up this type of a line and do it twice, I can see perhaps doing it once, perhaps it would just something that happened, but that they would not, he would not want to move forward down that pathway. It's to be seen. I think that he probably received enough feedback from people, including the media, that said that's probably not a smart thing to do. I do not want to see this race turn on that at all. I would like to see the race turn off policy, results, the direction the country would be going. And when we're in agreement is that where candidates are on the issues that they hold, and they need to speak to that themselves, both Mr. Trump and Kamala Harris. And I think that's where his frustration is, trying to get her, okay, where am I going to hold you accountable? Because he certainly is willing to work off his record.
So well, very quickly, before we let you go, because we are running out of time, J.D. Vance had a bit of a rocky rollout as the VP pick. Do you think he's ready to be president on day one?
Well, the question is he going to present himself well in his articulation to the American people? How is he going to match up compared to the vice presidential choice, Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota? These are all things that happen on the fly. That same thing that we saw as it related to President Biden when he matched up against Donald Trump. So there's more water.
It's not a ringing endorsement, Congressman. That's not a he's ready on day one ringing endorsement.
Well, but I mean, he's a new person, and I think that that's what he's getting now. He comes from Ohio. We're talking about how he would represent the United States of America. And I don't think we know enough about it, just like we wouldn't be a ringing endorsement of Kamala Harris. She has not exactly laid out at all where she is. And I'm willing to say, I'm willing to give them a chance to do that. That's what the American people want. They want to give someone a chance. They expect to hear specifics, and they want to know what they'd be held accountable for. And that's when the race will actually be understood.
Congressman Pete Sessions of Texas, thank you very much for your time on this Monday night, sir.